Once more, I want to take a minute to go back and have a look at our flow of data so that we're really on top of what's happening here. We'll start off with our database.csv file, which goes into our database loader, which then goes into our mesh generator, and then that finally goes into our prefab generator. And if we were to look at the data types, we would call this one a string or an array of strings, which then gets converted into an array of star info, which then gets converted into a mesh, which then gets converted into a game object. And yeah, so this is so far working really well. The thing is that for each of these individual stages, we've got a different generate button. So it's kind of like we got to generate our star info, then generate our mesh, then generate our game object, and then create an instance of that, because that game object is a prefab, create an instance of that prefab in the scene. And now that we're going to be doing some editing of this workflow, we don't want to keep going through that process every time we want to change something. We really want to make things easy for ourselves. So for that reason, we're going to create a instance. I'm going to call it an instance manager, which is going to take these three classes, the database loader, the mesh generator, and the prefab generator. So this will be our instance manager. Which will have access to each of these and be able to call the generate button and the load database button on each of them, and then create an instance from where this prefab lives in the scene, which will make things much easier for us. And then after that won't take too long, because after that we're going to look at what's going to happen. At the moment we're working with a sample of 10 stars or 9 stars. We're going to look at what sort of things we need to do to enable 120,000 stars. For example, with the mesh, this is really the focus of the lesson. With the mesh, you might know that a mesh can only have up to 65,000 vertices before it starts to stop rendering them. So we're going to have to break up our star info objects into several meshes, and we'll look at how to do that in a bit. So we'll start off just by creating this instance manager. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead into my scripts folder, create a new folder, just call it instance -managers, and a new class, call it instance manager .cs Alright, this is going to use Unity Engine public class instance manager. This is going to inherit from mono behavior, because this instance manager will live in the scene. Let's bring this over a bit. Okay, so really we can have a look at our data flow. So we have our database loader. So we'll need access to the database loader, public database loader. We're also going to need access to our star mesh generator, public star mesh generator, and we're also going to need our mesh prefab generator. So that's a public mesh prefab generator. We can really call this the star prefab generator. All right, so we're going to create a public a public function, generate and instantiate prefab. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to call the database loader load database. Once that's done, our mesh generator, which knows about the database loader, will then generate the mesh, and then the prefab generator will then generate the prefab from the mesh generator. So these three are already hooked up to each other, and we're just calling the functions on them. So database loader dot load database star mesh generator dot generate and star prefab generator dot generate. Now we know, for example, in our star prefab generator, we have a star prefab generator dot folder path. That's the path of the prefab that's been created that we want to create an instance of it. So let's go ahead and create a new function, and this will also be public. This will be instantiate prefab. Okay, so now we can use our asset utility. If I go ahead and open up my asset utility again, remember we have this function we created earlier, get assets at path. Now this is exactly the function we can use to get that game object that is at the path of our prefab generator. So we'll say var go equals asset utility. I'll call that prefab. Var prefab equals asset utility dot get assets at path of type game object, and we'll pass in the star prefab generator dot folder path. So that's the path where our prefab generator has saved the prefab, and this is going to return an array, but we really only want the first instance. Okay, now we have that prefab, we can go ahead and instantiate it. So we'll just say gameObject.instantiate prefab vector3.0 quaternion.identity, and we'll have it as a child of this object. Now there's one thing I want to notice, I want to point out here. If we press this button twice, we're going to end up with two instances. So we really want to keep track of every instance that we're creating. So I'm going to have another variable here. This is going to be private, but we don't want it to show up in the inspector, although we do want to save it. So by default, only public variables are serialized, which means that when you hit play mode or when you close the program and open it again, they get saved. We do want to save it. So this will be a game object, and it will be called instance. Okay, so now we just say instance equals this game object that instantiate. And we just got to make sure that if it already exists, that we want to delete the old version and create the new version. So to say if instance, can I say just if instance? Let's say, I'll be explicit. If instance is not equal to null, I won't be lazy. All right, so if the instance is not equal to null, we'll go ahead and destroy it immediately. GameObject.destroy immediate instance. Alrighty, so that's our instance manager done. Now we're going to do a few things to set up our multiple mesh generator. No, before that we'll test our code. It's good to test your code as you go. It makes you feel like you're making progress and whatnot. Okay, so we've got this prefab that we created earlier. I'm going to delete that for now. I'm going to create a new game object. I'll just call this star instance. That's not a very good name. Starchart instance. Starchart instance. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and add our instance manager. And luckily, at the moment, we only have one database loader and one mesh generator, and one prefab generator. So that's really easy for us to hook up. If we go ahead and press, I forgot the inspector. So just like with our generators and our database loaders, we're going to go ahead and create another one of these inspectors. The reason why we can't copy these other, or somehow inherit from the same objects as these other ones, is because these ones inherit from a scriptable object, and our instance manager is a mono behavior. So they're branching from different trees. So in our instance manager folder, I'm going to create a new folder called editor. That's important that it's called editor. And I'll create a new script called instance manager inspector.cs. Go ahead and copy this from our database loader inspector. And we're just going to change every time it says database loader to instance manager. And we're going to need to use Unity editor. And we're also going to need to use Unity engine. And we're just going to change that load database to generate and instantiate prefab. Okay, so we say generate and instantiate. I'm also going to add another function here. Let's say, for example, we've already generated all our objects, and we just want to reinstantiate it, just for a different workflow. I'm going to have another function just called instantiate. Another button. I'm going to change this where it says instantiate prefab. Where it says DL, I'm going to change that to IM. Instance manager. Alright, so now if we go back to our scene, multi-object, multi-object editing. Okay, so this is interesting. What have I got here? What have I done? Okay, I don't know. Yeah, sometimes if you've got somehow selected more than one object or something, for example, if I go like that, yeah, I think it's something like that. If I have more than one object selected, it doesn't like it. Anyway, so we're only selecting the Starchart instance, and we press generate and instantiate. You notice there's a little bit loading there. Oh, and I did forget, in our instance manager, I forgot to call instantiate prefab from the generate instantiate function. Instantiate prefab. Just wait for that to compile. Okay, generate and instantiate. Now we've got our instance here. If we press the button again, it'll be able to delete that instance and create another instance of it. Beautiful. So now we can start mucking around with stuff and really easily be able to update it and see what our changes did. So what I'll do is first of all we'll have a what do we do? Yeah, no, I'll give you an overview of what we're doing with our meshes, just a quick one, and then we'll just dive into it. So at the moment we've got an array of stars. Okay, so we've got an array of stars which is say we got array of star infos, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way eventually to 120,000. 120,000. That's a lot. and my single mesh won't be able to handle that. So what we can do is we can say, okay, well, let's say, for example, we only want a maximum of 10,000 vertices in a mesh. So for this example, let's use little numbers. It's always good to use little numbers to get your head around something. So let's say we only want I want something that's going to demonstrate something else. Okay, we want four stars per mesh. Okay, so we say for 0 to 3, create a mesh of that. For 4 to 7, create a mesh of that. From 8 till, let's say for example, if there was only 8, then we'll create another mesh with a single vertex in it. That'll be okay. So keep making these blocks, and then a final block will have the remainder. So that sounds fairly simple, and I suppose I'll just start creating it. We can see how that's going to look. first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an extension method that'll allow us to take these sections out of an array. I'm going to call it subarray. So we'll have an array dot subarray, which will pass in a start index and also a count. Okay, so we can pass in start index of 0 and a count of 4, which will give us elements 0 to 3. So equals 0, 1, 2, 3. And then we'll pass in an index of 4 and a length of 4, and we'll get 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we'll pass in etc. And a 8 and a length of 4, and we'll just get 8. As in, it will be able to handle, if you ask for 4 and there's not enough, it'll be able to handle that gracefully. So in our extension methods class, it's going to be a little bit similar. In fact, I'll copy paste this for each. It's going to be a bit similar to that. So instead of a void, it's going to return an IEnumerable of type T. It's going to call it subarray. Does that already exist? Oh no, it doesn't exist. We're going to use link queries using system.link. We're going to have a source. We're also going to have an integer, which will be a start index, and also another integer, which will be the count. We're simply going to return source.skip index, start index. Okay, so if the start index 0, it's going to skip 0 elements, etc. Start index 1, it'll skip 1 element. And then we're going to take the count. Take the amount. All right. That's literally all this extension method does. But it's very explicit, and when we're working with a whole bunch of other stuff, it's nice to have good variable names. You can just take a glance and understand what it's doing. Okay, our next thing we've got to do is, we've got to do a few little things to our database loader. Now, our database loader at the moment, this public star info stars up there, that is being displayed in the inspector. Now, that's been fine so far when we've just been using a few. If we try and in our inspector display 120,000, it's just not going to work. So we're going to go ahead and hide that in the inspector. And now we just go into our not our prefab generator. We're going to go into our star mesh generator, and we'll have a look at what's going on so far. Okay, so we have this database.stars, and we're creating a mesh from all the stars in that database. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, we got to say how many stars are going to be in each mesh. So let's create a public variable. Public integer stars per mesh equals, let's say, 10,000. I'm going to give it a range of something sensible, because for example, if we did 1 star per mesh, it'll create a lot of meshes, and that'll just throw things out. So maybe in a range of maybe 2,000, even that'll be quite a lot of meshes. 2,000 to 30,000 maybe. So we can play around with it, like maybe for optimization. I'm not sure which one would be best. Okay, now we're going to do a for loop for int I equals 0. I is less than stars per mesh. No, is that right? No, so let me check my notes. Yeah, okay, this is where it's kind of interesting. I is less than database.stars.length, and I plus equals stars per mesh. So for all of the stars in the database, we'll keep doing these chunks until this I is greater than the amount of stars in a mesh. First of all, let's make a nice name for the mesh. It's a string name equals, let's say stars, and then let's say we want to go stars 0, stars 1, stars 2, stars 3. If we say I out of stars per mesh, because I is incrementing by stars per mesh, that'll give us that number. As in, 0 out of 10,000 is 0. 1 out of 10,000. No, 10,000 out of 10,000 is 10,000, etc. Yeah, because I is incrementing by 10,000. I out of stars per mesh. Alright, so we've got that name. Now we're going to go ahead and get the subsection of stars. So star info stars equals database dot stars dot subarray. We'll pass in I as the start index and stars per mesh as the count. We're going to need to convert that to an array because that's returning as an IEnumerable. And now we're going to create a mesh for those stars, and then we're going to save that mesh. So we're really just doing this. We're moving this mesh and create mesh with the new name. And instead of creating a mesh out of all the stars, we'll create it out of this subarray of stars. Kind of want to call it like substars or something. Substars. I'll call it substars. I don't really, but at least that explains what it's doing. Okay. All right, let's give that a go. Now remember, our prefab creator is already set up to handle this sort of thing. Oh, you know what I want to do? I know I set because before I always do this, before I bring in the big data, I want to make sure that things are working well. So for now, I'm going to set the range of stars per mesh to 0, just so that we're able to work with this tiny amount of data, make sure that it's all being created properly, so that we don't get crashes and whatnot. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead into my mesh generator. I have stars per mesh. I'm just going to say 2 stars per mesh. I want to demonstrate that one of them is going to have an uneven amount of stars. So I'm going to say how many we've got. We've got 8 at the moment. No, we've got 9 at the moment. I'll do 4 stars per mesh. Okay, so at the moment, if we go into our meshes folder, we have 1 mesh. And I go star mesh generator, 4 stars per mesh, go generate. We should have 8, we should have 3 meshes. Hey, we've got 3 meshes. So one's got 4, one's got 4, and the last one will have 1. There we go, last one's got 1. Okay, good. It's nice when things are doing what they're expected to do. So now we'll go ahead to our Starchart instance, generate and instantiate. And if we have a look, So if we have a look at our instance of our prefab, we've got these sections of stars. And now, for the grand finale, make sure that everything's saved because we're about to do the full database. So instead of HYG sample, I'm going to copy this HYG data path. Go into procedural assets, database loader. Pass in that new path. Press generate. Oh no. But see, this is the thing. I almost did it with 2 stars or 4 stars per mesh, which would be 120,000 divided by 4. That's easy. That's 4, 8, 12, 16. That's 40,000 meshes, I think. Okay, let me just double check that. Okay, so we'll go back to 2,000 stars per mesh and make sure that we've got a reasonable amount of stars being generated. Yeah, so I'm going to change this to 10,000 stars per mesh, which will be, there should be 12 meshes. And we'll press generate. Okay, let it load. Hey, there we go. Look at that. And we have our stars. Generated very nicely. I'm going to change the size of the material for now, so we can get a better idea of what we're looking at. Also, I'm going to change the background so we can sort of see, make it look a bit black. If I go to main camera and clear flags, change that to solid color. I'm going to make it black. So maybe I did that too quickly. Just up here in the camera inspector, change the clear flags to solid color. Change the background to any color you like. Also in the scene, I can disable the skybox. Kind of makes things a bit easier to work with. Beautiful.